Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on environmental issues. This is one of those issues which I think people who are kind of in favor of free markets get a little weak on sometimes, because we think, well, maybe this is the area where we need some government intervention, because who's going to take care of the environment? And I'm hoping that I can shed some light on this and maybe help you see a little piece of this work that some Austrian economists have been doing on environmental issues. I'm going to focus here on environmental conservation. I may say a couple of words about pollution issues, but last year's talk was more on broader pollution control issues and those kinds of things. And I'll give you a QR code at the end that you can, if you go to that, then it'll take you to my page that's got my resources from last year as well. So I didn't want to overlap too much with last year. I wanted to do some new things on environmental conservation that I've been thinking about. But first, a kind of a preface, what is it that the mainstream says about markets and how do they relate to the environment? And of course, the threshold for government intervention is very, very low for most economists. And they will say, well, here's the problem with markets is that they fail. And they typically will say, okay, so there's the externality problem, which means that we've got these side effects of your behavior that adversely or positively affect somebody else. And the producer of that side effect is not really taking that impact into account when deciding how much of a good to produce. And so we get this kind of overproduction or underproduction argument centered on externalities. And this is really the framework behind a lot of mainstream treatment of pollution issues, that pollution is a negative effect of somebody's production. It's not like they're trying to hurt somebody else, but this is the side effect on bystanders. A second argument is that markets will underproduce public goods. And by public goods, the mainstream means not just goods that are produced by government, but goods that satisfy two characteristics. First of all, you can't exclude people who don't pay. There's no meaningful way to restrict use to those who are paying. And secondly, they will say it has to be non-rival, which means if one person consumes it, there's just as much left over for someone else. And the argument there is that this will lead to a free rider problem, where people decide to consume the good, but they don't contribute to its production. And so this is the basis for arguing that government should produce these public goods in order to supplement what markets will underproduce. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that argument here. I may touch on it when we get to some other issues later on. And then finally, there's the market power argument that governments are allegedly will have to intervene in order to deal with problems of monopoly. Of course, we know that government creates monopoly. I mentioned in a talk earlier this week the problem of patents, which are a government-created monopoly, and governments often engage in regulatory activity that restricts entry into an occupation or into an industry, and that creates this kind of problem with not being able to compete as you would on a free market. So the whole idea of market failure is that, well, there's this textbook ideal. Markets will be fully competitive, perfectly competitive. Everybody will have the same information. There will be no externality problem, and then markets don't actually live up to that textbook ideal. Therefore, we need to get government involved and correct for these kinds of things. I often point students to an article by Art Carden and Steve Horowitz, which, if you look up just Carden and Horowitz on externalities, and you'll probably find that article that's on, I think, econlib.org, on why it is that just because you've shown that the market failed, which I would say that by itself is a major problem, but even if you could show that, you would not be able to conclude that government should then intervene. There are too many other problems, and so I'd point you to that as a useful way of thinking about it. So even if you were able to show that the market failed, how do you know that the government's approach to the problem would be superior. And this is a very serious problem. So I want to go through several issues here and spend a lot of time here on central planning and conservation. That's a resource use question. We've got a lot of land in the United States that is under central planning effectively. And of course, coasts and ocean out to the whatever the legal limit is that nation states have this kind of control over oceans as well. And so especially if you look at the western United States, the majority, sometimes the vast majority of the land is actually under government control of one sort or another. This map that you see is only federal lands and Indian reservations in the United States. This does not include state land or municipal land. And even a lot of the private land is under various regulations that restrict the degrees of freedom that the owners have to operate. So, for example, Alaska is 91.2% federal and state land. Nevada is 85% federal and state land. And some of this is like BLM land, Bureau of Land Management. Some of this is military reservations, military bases. Some of this is national forests and so forth, state forests and the like. Now that is much more the case in the West, but also some eastern states like New York that you see here on this list is 37% federal and state land. Well, now some people celebrate this and they say, well, you know, the more land is in the hands of the government, the better. And a former colleague of mine, now retired from my institution back in South Carolina, took some students on a tour of coastal South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina. And he said, he wrote this up in an article, and he said, it's a bad idea to turn the whole future of a region over only to people with money to make. Like, this is going to result in a land use catastrophe of some kind, and that this is going to mean just strip malls and apartment buildings and cookie cutter houses, and there's not going to be any nature left if we just turn this over to people who are interested in making money. Well, there's a lot of assumptions in here. I mean, in the argument that we need to have these government lands set aside to conserve the land, there's the assumption that government knows what use of that land is best, and that it can decide whether this land ought to be used as wildlife habitat or forest, or a lot of this government land is leased out to people who graze their livestock on the land, or they cut the trees down on the land. And so government land is often used for resource extraction. It's also used for recreational purposes. It's not just land that's set aside as some sort of untouched wilderness. It is most often being used for various purposes. How do we know what use and how intense of a use is appropriate? Will government actually bring us closer to what we want to see? And of course, who's we? And what is that objective? And of course, we've all got our own objectives about what we'd like to see what we would like to see happen with land. Ironically, even if you're looking at this from a kind of a stereotypical environmentalist perspective, you're going to see government land being used in ways that is not very conducive to preserving wilderness, if that's really your objective. And in some cases, we see governments using land in ways that are very destructive of environmental quality. So how do we know what is the optimal use? How do we know that land is best used as wildlife habitat, or for extracting trees for lumber, or used for housing, or used for some other purpose? Discovering this information is something that markets are really good at, because they can tap into those subjective preferences that individuals have and we see the result of that market process that produces a land use that is conducive to people's interests. Friedrich Hayek in 1979, in his book Law, Legislation, and Liberty, said that this welfare economics, this method of trying to assess the best uses of property, which pretends, he said, to base its arguments on the interpersonal comparisons of utilities, lacks all scientific foundation. The fact that most of us believe that they can judge which of the several needs of two or more known persons are more important does not prove either that there is any objective basis for this, nor that we can form such a conception about people whom we do not know individually. The idea of basing coercive actions by government on such fantasies is clearly an absurdity. So we don't really, you ask each person, well, what do you think should happen with a given piece of property, like, say, the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge on the Arctic coast of Alaska, which actually has a lot of oil underground, apparently. What should happen to that? You ask one person, they're going to say, well, it should be left for wildlife. It shouldn't be touched. And other people are going to say, well, it should be drilled. We should drill the land. And to make those kinds of assertions that you know best what's going to happen, what should happen to that land it's a naked assertion. You have no basis for making that kind of statement other than to say that, well, that's your preference. There's no way to compare utilities and to say this is the best. My suggestion for this land is the best. Without the market discovery process, how do we know? And in fact, we don't. I can't say, well, it should be drilled. I can't say it should be used for wildlife habitat. So what we can do is we can say, well, let's look at the institutional surroundings, the kind of market environment that could allow people to make efficient decisions. And then we can improve economic outcomes without trying to make these interpersonal utility comparisons, without me trying to say, well, my desire for oil is more important than your desire for wildlife, or vice versa. So let's think about development restrictions in particular. And this gets back to what my former colleague was arguing about the coastal Atlantic states, where we see development after development, strip malls and wider highways and so forth. And we know that people do value natural landscapes, and we also know that when people develop land, they often try to preserve these natural landscapes. For example, there's an island on the coast of South Carolina, Kiowa Island, where the developer said, well, we want to put houses on this property, on this island, but we also want to preserve some of the natural habitat because people like habitat. They're more willing to live in a place where they are looking across their road and they're seeing marsh, or a salt marsh, or they're seeing palm trees or deer walking by. They're not seeing a strip mall. And people are willing to pay more for that kind of amenity. But that does tend to be expensive because it means foregoing some of the alternative uses of the land. So there's this trade-off between giving people access to land by giving them houses that are closer to, say, the beach, and having that land be affordable. If you prescribe this kind of low-density development along the coast, then that means not many people are going to be able to afford to live there. So if you prohibit development, as many people are inclined to do, especially in fast-growing areas, they start to appeal to government to create these kinds of green zones or limitations on development of one sort or another. That will reduce the supply available for housing and for other things that people want and increase the price. So housing availability goes down, the cost of visiting the beach goes up, the cost of visiting a wilderness area goes up. Desirable land becomes even more inaccessible unless you're, of course, very wealthy. So I've got an article in the works for Mises.org on the history of land conservation by the government. And one of the things that we see is a kind of an alliance between groups that want to see land conserved for wildlife or wilderness areas and people who want to drive up property values. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Let's think about this in a kind of a supply and demand framework, and I'll ask you to bear with me as I go through a couple of supply and demand graphs here. So here we've got a coastal zone A, and I'll get to coastal zone B in a minute. But here is the supply and demand for this land in coastal zone A. And you'll notice I've got 1990 here as the year, so this is 35 years ago. Here's the quantity and the price of that land. And somebody comes along and says, well, we don't like how fast this area is being developed. We don't like the fact that there are all these houses and apartment buildings and strip malls and restaurants and everything else being built here, so we want to put restrictions on this. And let's suppose they're successful, and that puts a hard limit on how much land can be developed in that coastal zone. So no impact right away. As you can see, this point is still legal. It's not, there's no problem, there's no restriction here that's really having an impact yet. However, once economic prosperity increases and we get more people maybe moving into the area, this becomes a binding constraint. This becomes a problem for people who want to buy houses and build strip malls and enjoy all of the amenities that people can bring into this area through development. And that means that instead of the price simply going to PM 2030 here, we have now PG 2030, the government imposed price through this land restriction, through this development restriction. And so now the price is going to be a lot higher. It's going to be higher than it would have been had land been developed without these restrictions. Okay, so let's now look at coastal zone B. This is maybe a neighboring or adjacent coastal zone down the highway on the coast, and we have no restriction on this zone. And so ordinarily, without the restriction in coastal zone A, we would have seen the price of the land go up as demand increases, as you have more population growth and affluence and so forth. However, because coastal zone A was kind of locked down and restricted because of the animosity toward development, now that means that people are going to flee to the neighboring area, coastal zone B. The demand for coastal zone B will rise, and therefore the price of land in that neighboring zone will also rise. And this, by the way, should give you a clue as to why some developers like to see development restrictions, as strange as that may seem, because if you're a developer who owns land or controls land in coastal zone B, you want that land neighboring yours to be locked off and prevented from having any kind of competing development. It means your land becomes more valuable. So the end result is we get higher prices everywhere. Ironically, some of the very same people who will say, we need to have green zones and we need to restrict development, we need to make sure that we have more land that's set aside as undeveloped, same people sometimes will complain that housing prices are too high. We need affordable housing. Well, why don't you have affordable housing? Well, because you prevented people from building housing. So this should not be terribly surprising that this is the result, but it is an inconsistency in how many people begin to think about this. We call this kind of phenomenon where land is developed in a kind of a sprawling manner, urban sprawl, where cities seem to expand outward rather than expanding upward in their central districts. And so some economists have suggested that we need to have some kind of zoning, maybe in these more rural or suburban areas, to try to prevent conversion of open space land. I was looking at a post on X by a state politician in South Carolina this week actually, where he was advocating for setting aside some big chunk of land as a green zone and so forth. And he's kind of a generally in favor of free markets, but he doesn't seem to see the inconsistency here, or maybe he's too persuaded by political pressures. But sometimes what you'll see is a state or maybe a city government will impose these land restrictions, development restrictions in a belt around a populated area. And so what we actually see happening as a result of some of these restrictions is that people move further out past the belt. They then get in their vehicles and they clog highways going back and forth, spending hours of their time every day from way outside the green zone where land is still affordable into the city where they work. And so you've simply extended commutes, cause them to buy more gasoline, cause them to put more miles in their cars, cause them to get into more car accidents and lose their lives sometimes on these highways because they're commuting because they were not allowed to live closer to work because of these restrictions. An example of this is Toronto, which over the years began to impose restrictions on more and more land outside of the immediate area of Toronto. And as a result, the neighboring communities outside the green zone began to expand. And in some cases, it seems that this is driving people out of the city rather than encouraging denser development into the city, which is what some of these planner types seem to have in mind. One law in LA County prevented undeveloped, non-contiguous areas from being zoned for urban densities and instead were zoned for low-density housing. So instead of apartment buildings, condos, et cetera, now you've got single-family dwellings. I have nothing against single-family dwellings. I live in one. I like my little quarter-acre lot. But at the same time, if we impose a restriction that says you can only have lot sizes of these dimensions or larger, or this square footage or larger, then you are limiting how many people can move into a certain area, and you're driving up house prices. So as a result of LA County's restrictions, what we saw happening is that people ended up going even further outside of the area that was being so controlled by these zoning restrictions. And so we got leapfrogging, where people were moving not just a little further out, but much further out. And again, those commuting distances increase with all the attendant problems from that. Let's move on here to federal land conservation. I'm going to give you some background here because I think this is interesting. I was reading through some of Rothbard's work on the Progressive Era, his book, The Progressive Era, which Patrick Newman edited, and it's enlightening. It was enlightening to me to see some of the background behind some of the early conservation efforts, and you think immediately of people like Theodore Roosevelt. And growing up, I thought, oh, well, that's kind of nice. We had some land set aside for national parks, and I'm kind of glad that it's a national park, and I wouldn't want to see a Hilton hotel on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I mean, there are hotels on the edge of the Grand Canyon, but I like wilderness. I like to go hiking. I visited a number of national parks, and so the instinct a lot of people have is that we need to have government set aside this land. Well, let's dig a little deeper in this. Some of the early players in this were Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Bureau of Forestry, which was a growing bureaucracy in the early 20th century, and of course Theodore Roosevelt, who got his face on Mount Rushmore, partly as a result of this preservation effort or conservation effort. And then, maybe more surprising, timber firms, railroads, and other industrialists wanted to see land locked up by the government and no development allowed on that land, or very little development allowed on the land. Now, you might say, well, why would a an industrialist, and especially why would a timber company that makes money cutting down trees want the government to set aside land and regulate its use? Oh, and then we've got, of course, the ideologically motivated conservation advocates. You know, people who, they like trees, they like mountains, they like to see wilderness areas, and I like all of those things myself. And they just say, well, we want national parks because we like wilderness, or we want national forest land because we like wilderness. So Rothbard points out that the interests of these timber companies, the interests of some of these other firms, were to drive up their own profits by shutting out their competition. Nothing wrong with making a profit, but when you're making a profit by getting the government to prevent your competition from emerging, we call that crony capitalism. All right, it's not really capitalism, it's a distortion of it. And we see this a lot with the early conservation movement. So the government basically said, we're going to keep this timberland out of commission. We're not going to allow it to be used freely. And so any privately owned timber suddenly increases in value. This is sort of like when Weyerhaeuser, a timber company, many years ago, began to hire, on its own initiative, hire wildlife biologists to go onto land and look for an endangered species of owl. If they found any of these, then that would mean that the Fish and Wildlife Service would draw a big circle around the owl colony and say, you can't cut down any trees on this land. Now, why would a timber company want to go look for owls that would lock up timber? Well, they weren't looking for owls on their land. They were looking for owls on land that other timber companies could use, land that was government owned, that could be leased for use by these other companies. And so Weyerhaeuser ended up making profits because they were shutting out some of their competing resources and therefore driving up the value of their own. Now, I mentioned railroads earlier. This might be a little bit unclear. So the shaded areas here are the land grants given by the U.S. government to the transcontinental railroads in the latter half of the 1800s. Land grants were the main means of subsidizing these transcontinental railroads. They were given alternating blocks of land along their routes. And the railroads would then sell this land and make piles of money off of the sale of the land. And you can see that there is quite a bit of land that would be owned by the railroads. Now, if you're the railroad and you own all of this land, you want to be able to get the highest price possible for that. How do you do this? Well, you get the government to conserve other land that's not yours, so that when people do homestead land or they move out into these western areas and establish their ranch or homestead or farm or whatever, they're going to have to do this, or at least they're going to be more likely to do this on railroad-owned land and not this other land that the federal government has locked away. And so what we see is the national forests, the national parks, and other kinds of land set-asides were means to an end. And the end is, well, yes, to satisfy some of the Eastern ideologically motivated conservationist types, but also to satisfy the timber companies and the railroads. And of course, the U.S. Forest Service bureaucracy, which gets more jobs and a bigger budget because they've now got more land to manage. And so the government administrative state begins to expand, and it itself is a type of interest group that will seek to aggrandize itself at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer and a lot of other people. And of course, the politicians who are kind of brokering these deals where the conservationist ideologues get what they want, and the timber companies get what they want, and the railroads get what they want. And there was some pushback from people who were livestock owners who wanted ranch land and wanted grazing rights and so forth. We'll talk about grazing rights next. But this, on the whole, seems to have been the engine behind a lot of the so-called conservation efforts. And you can see the hypocrisy here, because some of the same groups who are saying, we need to conserve land, let's have a national forest over here, or let's have a national park over here, the same people were supporting initiatives or policies like tariffs on imported lumber. Now think about this for a minute. Who benefits from tariffs on imported lumber? Well, domestic lumber producers, right? So this helps the domestic lumber producers. Of course, if you want to build a house and you plan to use lumber for it, then that's going to cost you, but if you're the lumber company, you want this, right? If you have a tariff that prevents lumber from being brought in from another country, let's say Canada, are we going to see more trees or fewer trees cut down in the United States? More trees, right? You're preventing the import of lumber from other countries, and so now, of course, the timber is going to have to come from domestic sources more often, and so now you're going to cut down more trees. If you're really interested in preserving forests in their natural state, why would you want to support national forests for some sort of conservation purpose and at the same time support a policy that encourages the cutting down of more trees domestically? It's inconsistent. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it's lumbering. I'm not saying lumbering is morally offensive or anything like that. It's just these two things are not consistent unless the objective behind the national forest was to work toward the profits of the lumber companies. In addition, we see governments subsidizing development at the same time that they are engaging in these kind of pro-conservation efforts, like subsidizing irrigation on railroad land. So again, railroads are major beneficiaries from this. Also, we see land being put off limits to homesteaders, even if it is not locked up in a national forest or national park or other kind of government-owned land. The Reclamation Act of 1907 made land that might one day eventually be irrigated. Now you can't homestead that, locking up even more land. Earlier homesteading rules that had allowed, I think up to 320 acres to be homesteaded were repealed, and so now you can only homestead, I think, a maximum of maybe 120 acres. I don't know if my math is right on that. Anyway, so by restricting the amount of land that can be homesteaded, it is essentially making it uneconomical to homestead large chunks of Western land, because Western land tends to be dry. You're not going to have as much grass per acre for your livestock, and so if you're limited to only 160 acres, then you are not going to be able to make your ranch work. So the homesteading restrictions effectively locked up even more land as just not being economically viable for development. All right, so just a couple of comments here about the tragedy of the commons. Some of you may have seen this if you've taken an introductory economics class, at least I hope you have. And this is basically if you can imagine a pasture and in a village, and there are people that live around the pasture, and each one of them has maybe 2 or 3 or 4 cows, and they put the cows out to graze on this common pasture. If no one owns this pasture, then the pasture is likely to be overgrazed, because each person who's considering the benefits and the costs of putting a cow out to graze on the pasture is going to think, okay, well, I get all of the benefits of whatever grass my cow eats. I get none of the benefits of the grass my cow does not eat, that is eaten by some other person's cow. And so I get all of the benefits of my cow grazing. I suffer none of the costs, or a very small fraction of the costs of any overgrazing. That overgrazing is felt by everyone, and I'm only a small part of that. So this leads to a kind of an incentive problem where each person's going to put the cow out to graze, even if it means less overall productivity from that pasture. So, you could think of this as a kind of in a game theory setting here, where you have Rancher Al and Rancher Bob, and each of them have 2 cows, and they're trying to decide on each day, do I put one of my 2 cows out to graze that day, or both of them, or maybe I sell off a cow and only keep one. If they both put 1 cow out to graze, they each get 5, let's say 5 pounds of weight gain per cow, per rancher rather. And so if Rancher Bob puts 1 cow out to graze and Rancher Al puts 2 cows out to graze, then Al gets 6 pounds of weight gain for his livestock. Bob gets only 3. And you'll notice that there's 10 total pounds here, there's only 9 here, and that is because with 3 cows grazing, there's not as much grass, it's not growing as fast, or not recovering as easily to allow weight gain for each rancher. If they both put 2 cows out to graze, then we wind up in this bottom right-hand cell here, where each person is getting 4 pounds of weight gain for their livestock total. So here's the tragedy, right? So if Rancher Al is thinking, okay, how many cows should I put out to graze? Well, if Bob is going to put 1 cow out to graze, then my choice is either I get 5 pounds or I get 6 pounds. I'll take 6, so that means I'll put 2 cows out to graze. If Rancher Bob is going to put 2 cows out to graze, then my choice is either get 3 pounds if I put 1 cow out myself, or 4 pounds if I put 2 cows out to graze. I'll take 4. 4 is better than 3. And of course, the math works the same way for Rancher Bob, who is thinking, okay, if Al is putting 1 cow out to graze, I can get 6 if I put 2 of mine out to graze as opposed to 5. So you see it's symmetric. So the incentive is for both ranchers to put both cows out to graze. The total amount of weight gain is 4 apiece instead of 5 apiece. They end up in a worse position than they would have if each of them had put only 1 cow out onto the pasture. So the key is nobody owns this land. That is why we call it a commons. And that is the reason it is going to produce this adverse result. There's overgrazing. If either Al or Bob or some third party were to own this commons, then that person would be able to get higher prices for leasing the grazing rights if they were to restrict the grazing to only 1 cow per rancher. But that kind of restriction is only possible if someone has ownership rights and therefore control over that pasture. Now, we've actually seen this happen in the American West. Now, I'll get into some of the details of this in a minute, but let me show you this picture, one of my favorite pictures that I show to students all the time. This is a border between 2 countries. On the left, you've got Haiti. On the right, you have the Dominican Republic. You'll notice that Haiti, the Haitian land is barren for the most part. The Dominican Republic land is heavily forested. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that Haiti is not as good at protecting property rights over land compared to the Dominican Republic. If you look at the economic freedom index of these 2 countries, Haiti has a very low rank at 103 last time this index registered Haiti, and then the Dominican Republic has has a much higher rank of 62. The protection of property rights rating, not a ranking, but a rating, is much higher for the Dominican Republic. Could be better, could be a lot better, but it is definitely higher than for Haiti, indicating that the Dominican Republic is more aggressive about protecting those property rights of landowners in that country. Well, in the American West, we saw a kind of a land communism where the tragedy of the commons was for a time able to take hold. Cattlemen wanted to see privatization of Western lands. They sought legal homesteading of cattle ranches. This was not agreed to by government, and so we ended up with a kind of a free-for-all, a commons of grazing land in the West. Range wars erupted between different owners of livestock, and public grazing land capacity fell by half in the last decade of the 1800s. No ownership means you get that tragedy of the commons. Samuel Hayes wrote that the public range rapidly deteriorated. Originally plentiful and lush, the forage supply was subjected to intense pressure by increasing use. The number of Western cattle grew rapidly after the Civil War. A rising sheep industry claimed its right to share in the public range, and settlers transformed grazing lands into more valuable cropland. And he goes on and basically says, look, the result of this is you end up with not only less grass, but you end up with more weeds instead of grass that's really useful for cattle and so on. Eventually, the government began to allow long-term leases for grazing, which is at least a step in the right direction. It reduced some of that tragedy of the commons, but the damage remained, and some people believe that the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, that drought that with the destruction of the topsoil, had to do with the grazing and the farming practices that were driven by the regulations on land and the land use that was dictated by government in the preceding decades. That land would have been had more healthy grass cover had it not been for these policies. Finally, and I don't have a lot of time left, just a couple of minutes here, but I wanted to mention a few things of more recent interest. I wrote an article that's on Mises.org about the wildfire that consumed the facilities at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I've been there twice, and it was, of course, distressing for me, especially having been there and visited on occasion, to see that the lodge, which dated back to the 1930s, had been destroyed, the visitor center burned down because of a wildfire. And so I suggest you take a look at that article. But one of the things I mention in that article is the bootleg fire of 2021 in Oregon burned more than 400,000 acres and provided a kind of a natural experiment in land management. So what you see here in this picture is three different types of land management. In the bottom of the picture, you have land that was thinned. That is, a lot of the underbrush was removed. You can see it's still burned. You can see, however, that the trees are still standing as opposed to the top of the picture where there was no treatment of the land at all. It was not subjected to a kind of a controlled burn. It was not thinned, and everything was just consumed in that fire. And yet, when that fire, which had topped out into the treetops, and you had these 200-foot flames, and it hit this middle section where there had been thinning and there had been controlled burns, and the trees you can see are still green. Why is this? Well, that land was privately owned. The other land, neighboring land, was not. So the neighboring land is the Fremont-Wanima National Forest, and the middle portion there is the Nature Conservancy's, one of the Nature Conservancy preserves, which they actively manage. So unlike the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy had actively managed their land, and as soon as that fire got to their land, it kind of ran out of fuel because the land had been carefully managed. So it's sort of, it's that picture, but it's this. I mean, it's like that meme. They're the same thing. So you've got, in one case, the property is well managed and it's privately owned. You don't get that same kind of bureaucratic procedure that's standing in the way of proper management. And in the other case, you've got, well, I am not going to be able to get to my property rights section, but if you go to my QR code here, you can go back to my 2024 lecture at Mises U, and I've got my slides from that lecture where I spent a lot more time talking about pollution issues. And of course, I've got to advertise a book that I contributed to here. I wrote a chapter for this. It's in the bookstore. If you're interested in climate issues, energy issues, so we talk about some of that in that book that came out last year. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions afterward here.